Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Believe me, it makes perfect sense.
Well, it's Groundhog Day again. Welcome to the podcast. I say that because we tried to record yesterday and it was an hour and a half of not recording. Here we are. We welcome you to the podcast. I'm Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
This is a podcast where we talk about apologetic stuff. We interview apologists, authors, thinkers, all surrounding the idea of, is Christianity true, defending the faith, and looking and exploring issues pertinent to the culture we're living in. So today, we're doing a book review. If you were listening a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this book, and Chad suggested it. It's called Rational Faith, A Philosopher's Defense of Christianity. And as I stare at the name to get it right, Stephen T. Davis with a PH. Chad, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to discussing this book. As you know, it's one of my favorites. It's a little gem that I got years ago from IVP, InterVarsity Press. I didn't request it, actually, and it just kind of showed up in my mail, and it was on my shelf for a while. And it's a short book, and so I picked it up one day, and man, I couldn't put it down. And I'm going to talk about, when we get going here, I'm going to talk about some of the reasons I love the book so much.
Yeah, so when we say short book, we're talking 174 pages, pretty standard print size, pretty standard hold it in your hand size. And how would you describe the book, Chad?
Well, I think the best way to describe it would just be to talk about what I love about it. What I love about it is that a lot of times, especially when you have a podcast like this one, or you just read a lot of apologetics work, it just seems like you begin to come across the same arguments and regurgitated in a different form. And you feel like sometimes you're reading you're almost reading the same book over and over again, in a sense. And one of the things I love about this book is that it gives, as the subtitle says, a defense of Christianity. But it does so in a way where it deals with some of the more prominent thinkers in the skeptical community. He also, Stephen Davis, does so with some original thinking and some original arguments. And you can tell as you're reading the book, it's like thinking along with him. And I found that really refreshing. And I just like the fact that he kind of argues a case for Christianity, and then he takes on a couple of the more substantial challenges to Christianity. And he does so in what I think is a very thoughtful way, and in a way that is unique to him. And again, not something you hear repeated often. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, A Philosopher's Defense of Christianity. And that's really what makes it a little bit different for me reading it. Now, so the reader or the listener, who is the potential reader, here are 9 chapters. Is there any such thing as objective truth? Good start, kind of like the Turek style thing. You know what I mean?
It's funny you said that, because I actually want to talk about the title of the book. Yeah. And I'm going to use Frank Turek as a comparison. So it's funny that you brought him up. Yeah.
Yeah. Number 2, why believe in God? So, that's reminiscent in my mind of like William Lane Craig, where he will, before he goes into the arguments, he's talking about the relevance of it. Mm-hmm. Number 3, is the Bible's picture of Jesus reliable? Number 4, was Jesus raised from the dead? Number 5, does evolution disprove Christianity? Number 6, can cognitive science explain religion? Number 7, is Christianity unique? Number 8, do evil and suffering show that God does not exist? And number 9, can we be happy apart from God? Yeah, so a fairly good broad structure of the book. But man, he covers so much ground in such a short amount of time. And as you say, the thing that's enjoyable about it, if you like that sort of thing, is that he takes you along his chain of thinking. He's not, and one of the things is that he's not trying to prove Christianity's true, but to show it's rational and intellectually defensible. So that's a way different thing. Whereas if you were trying to prove it true, you would try to be just laying out all these arguments and making a hard cumulative or like a strong cumulative case. Whereas in this, he's like, well, here's sort of like the overall logic of why you'd think it's true. And here's the chain of thought and all the various arguments that come along for the ride to get you there. But he's not like making a sales pitch or a hard case where it's like, okay, now that I've proven this, now we can use another building block and I'm going to give you this. It doesn't do that. And so that's refreshing because you can kind of read through it without being like, well, I don't know if I accept that, because he's not trying to make you accept that.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. One of the things that I love about this book is I think it's a great example of humble apologetics. And you're touching on why I think that. And what I mean by that is, and you've brought up Frank Turek, who, you know, we've had on the podcast, and I definitely have benefited from his work and enjoy his stuff. But the difference between this book and Turek is, like you said, in this book, his goal is to just demonstrate that it is rational to believe, that Christianity is rational. It's almost like if you're going to believe or if you're going to disbelieve, he's just trying to remove that stumbling block of it. Well, it's irrational, right? He's trying to give people permission to look into this and to believe and to show. Whereas sometimes when you're reading, for example, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, it's almost like there's this feeling of this is the most rational view. And sometimes and again, I benefit from Dr. Turek's work, but sometimes it can even smack of like, you're crazy not to believe this. It's almost, there's a difference between, I feel like Turek and Geisler in that book are attempting to compel someone to believe, whereas Davis is just trying to say, hey, this is rational, you know, check it out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And then I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. They're basically, even with the title, saying, you know, it's not rational, or, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's not rational to not believe. It's sort of like saying you need more faith to be an atheist. They say that throughout, you know, and so I appreciate that. It was one of my favorite first books I read, you know. I look back on that. I think Geisler, to my mind, is a little too much of a, well, here's the proof, accept it or not. Yeah. And it's just too hard of a sales. It's a little American for me, in the sense of like, we're the best. This is the best argument. This is, you know, and rational faith is, as you say, is a little bit more of a humble approach. Now, I know we're going to talk about various things, but one thing that I think demonstrates that, and you mentioned it when we were introducing the book a few weeks ago, or a few episodes ago, I should say. Yeah. You said people might disagree with certain conclusions. One is this chapter on evolution.
Sure.
Now this is not where we're going to sit on this book at all, listener, in case you're thinking. But he just says, well, you know, my view is I think theistic evolution is true, but I don't read that and get all defensive. The way he writes it is like, well, here's my rationale behind that. And his whole, I actually like the fact that that's his view, because if you are trying to remove obstacles for the unbeliever, then you can say, well, like, here, this philosopher who, you know, Christians might disagree with this conclusion, but, you know, the bar is not, the only way you could be a Christian and accept the Bible is if you jettison evolution because it sabotages the entire thing from the ground up, you know? So I kind of like the fact that if you were giving this to a non-believer, it would be way better for them than to say, oh, well, I'm a 6-day creationist. You know, it's going to lose some credibility in their mind, you know, most non-believers, because of course they're not thinking, I mean, there's no atheist who's a 6-day creationist at the same time. You know what I'm saying? They have to be an evolutionist. So if you're lowering the bar, just say, hey, this is still rational, and this is not a central tenet of faith.
No, it's really funny. You've talked about, you know, the title, Rational Faith, and how that's Davis's project here is to just show that Christianity is rational. That was one of the things I had in my notes one of the other things I had in my notes is very much like what you just said. So it's really funny how it's like you're reading my mail. So, yeah, in that chapter where he, defends theistic evolution, it's a great example of what I'm talking about, though, of that humble apologetic. If you think back to that chapter, he lays out young earth creationism, old earth creationism, ID. He doesn't besmirch them, if you will, or attack them or anything. He lays them out as views and then says, here's where I come down, right? And so again, it's just him saying, this is how I make sense of this, but he doesn't make it a central issue or an issue that, will make or break whether or not you accept Christianity. And I very much agree with you. I remember once I was at Panera having a conversation with an atheist, and he was very much putting a lot of stock, if you will, in evolution. And I remember I said to him, look, I'll give you evolution. I'll give it to you. You can have evolution. I said, you still need to explain the origin of the universe, the fine tuning of the universe, objective moral truths, the historical evidence for Jesus's resurrection. Evolution doesn't touch any of that. I said, so even if I give you biological evolution, it really doesn't get you very far. And so I see this kind of like what you're saying is, even if you don't necessarily agree with theistic evolution, you could put this in the hands of somebody, and this would at least lay out the views for them and help them to see that, oh, okay, I don't have to come down hard on one of these views in order to be a Christian or to conclude that Christianity is rational.
Yeah, good point. For anybody who's wondering, well, where's Stephen T. Davis from? He was a Christian philosopher, but he was at Claremont McKenna College. So, as you said, he's now retired.
Yes, and last year I reached out to him via email and asked him to come on the podcast to talk about this book. And he wrote back and thanked me very much for my positive comments about the book. But he said, I am retired and I don't do that kind of thing anymore. And I told my wife that it was the first time since we've been doing the podcast that I genuinely remember getting the email. My heart just sunk a little bit because I wanted to talk to him so bad.
Yeah, you probably saw that it arrived and you're like, yeah, oh
yes.
no.
Yes, but I totally respect that and totally get it. But, just selfishly, I really wanted to chat with him and pick his brain about some things and just let him know how highly I thought of the book.
Yeah, you're very selfish. So anyway, the relationship between faith and reason, that's one of the sort of themes. He discusses arguments for God's existence and then the reliability of the Gospels. Mm-hmm. Of those sorts of areas are there anything that pops out you want to talk about?
Yeah, what I really appreciated about Davis in this book, and I wish more Christian thinkers would do this, is that he comes right out and says, before he's giving a rational case, right, for the faith, he comes right out and says, hey, the number one reason I'm a Christian is because I was raised that way. And he doesn't try to hide it. He doesn't apologize for it. He doesn't lament it. And he doesn't feel the need to say, but that doesn't mean I can't have good reasons to believe or anything like that. He says, hey, I was raised this way. I was raised to believe this way. And then he moves forward with giving arguments and reason because he understands that he needs to offer, warrant for these beliefs to somebody who hasn't been raised that way, who hasn't had those experiences. But I don't know about you, but I found it very refreshing that he just came out of the gate. And one of the primary things he says when he's talking about the existence of God is that the number one reason I believe is because I was raised that way. And he didn't apologize for it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because you just got to be honest with people when you're talking to them. Hey, here's my journey. You don't need to present some I never had any good reasons, but then I investigated it and I came to the conclusion nobody can be like J. Warner Wallace or something where they go into their detective mode and then reach Christianity or Lee Strobel or something. I think that the honesty approach in that is the key. And not to say that people are not going to be honest, but there might be the pressure to try to bolster one's case by appearing overly analytical and appealing to this thing. No, you have emotional reasons. You have emotional reasons. They're your heart reasons, so to speak. Heck, you could even have the journey where like maybe you came to faith at some hellfire preaching or something and you're scared of going to hell and that's how you became a Christian. I don't think you should hide that, but if you then later investigated and like you thought, hey, well, then I realized that, maybe is this true or not? Like, did my experience, was that just hype? I got to go check this out. And so I think that people, if they hear your full story without like ejecting parts that you might think, oh, that maybe they might not think I'm rational if I let them know this, not a good approach,
Yeah. And I think of my own, story, and I've shared my own story with people that, I guess I had what some people would call a little bit more of a dramatic conversion. And, I've had people say something like, oh, well, I wish I had a testimony like that. And of course, my first thought is no, you don't. Trust me. But secondly, I like the fact, again, that Davis shares this because it could allow somebody like that to think, oh, here's a guy who was raised just like I was, and he's doing great philosophy, And so I don't need to have that dramatic Paul, kind of conversion in order to do great things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So want to talk about these cosmological arguments and such that he talks about?
Yeah. So I really enjoyed he presents kind of an argument from contingency. I like how he calls it his generic cosmological argument. I really appreciated that. And it was really cool just to see he basically lays out a couple options. He says the world is entirely accidental or just has no explanation. That's one option. Or the world was brought into existence by some sort of creator. And he goes on to say that his contention is that this world is the sort of world we would expect to exist if it were created by God. And he believes that kind of God's central aim in creating human beings is that as many of them as possible would come to freely worship, love, and obey him. And then he goes into, again, an argument that Aquinas has argued for, and Leibniz and Samuel Clarke, people like that. And in his version, the premises go like this. If the existence of the universe can be explained, then God exists. Everything can be explained. Talk about that in a minute. The universe is a thing. It's pretty uncontroversial. Therefore, the universe can be explained, and therefore God exists. Now, of course, that idea that everything can be explained is what philosophers call the principle of sufficient reason. And of course, that's the idea that everything has an explanation of its existence, either by an external cause or by the necessity of its own nature, right? And what I was really impressed in the book, this is probably the best, most succinct defense of the PSR, or the principle of sufficient reason, that I've read. I thought it was clear. I thought it was in depth, and I thought that he argued very persuasively that principle is indeed sound.
Yeah, and although it's written by a philosopher, I didn't think he used overly philosophical language. It seemed to be simple enough for the lay person, without heavy jargon or anything like that.
Right. I think that's a strength, honestly, throughout the book. It is a philosopher's defense of Christianity, but he also states in the book that he wrote it largely for his students. Remember, he talks about how, students were coming to him with questions, and this was largely his attempt to show them that Christianity had a rational kind of foundation, and also to fellow faculty workers and people like that who were willing to look into it.
And back to the other theme, he's not using this as a proof, but part of a case. He would anticipate a number of objections to that. Like, for instance, if, the universe could be its own explanation. So then he says, well, that contradicts the evidence. It contradicts logic. The physical laws and matter alone don't have the power to cause themselves. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's just a nice read through,
Yeah.
without getting bogged down.
I just thought it was interesting before he kind of presents his cosmological argument. He goes on to say that the kind of a couple purposes of arguments like this are, number one, to show skeptics that religious belief is not gullible or superstitious. And it also can be useful in increasing the confidence of religious believers. And so I like that kind of twofold purpose of theistic arguments that he lays out.
Just showing it's rational, but also like, it's bolstering the faith of believers, you know?
And I think sometimes that's, getting away from the book a little bit, that's sometimes what, at least when I speak on apologetics, a lot of times what happens is that people will come up to me and they'll say something along the lines was, well, I don't need these arguments. I know God exists. I experience him in my everyday life. And of course, my response to that is, well, number one, you are also sharing this with other people, and there might be other people who do need these arguments, and to show that it's rational to give them permission to investigate this, if you will. But then on the other hand, your faith might be enriched by learning these arguments because you realize that the confidence that you have in your faith is even more well-founded than you knew prior. I know the first time I learned the cosmological argument and the idea that the universe came into existence, from nothing, the idea that this all-powerful being was able to create out of nothing. I mean, it definitely was a worshipful kind of aha for me, that I otherwise wouldn't have had if I wouldn't have been reflecting on these types of arguments.
Yeah. I think of the things within there, when you're talking about the principle of sufficient reason, that's one of my faves. I think that's such I think it's just intuitive, like the design thing we've talked about in the past. I think appealing to design is so intuitive. It's just a matter of reminding people of what's all around them because they're just blind to it because it's just everywhere, the design aspects. But with the principle of sufficient reason, it's sort of like cause and effect in a sense. Everything needs a cause. That's sort of part of it. But even if the universe is eternal, if you were arguing that, well, why? Why is it there? Why is it eternal? So there's always this, for me, the principle of sufficient reason is that there has to be some explanation for things, for how things are. And the only thing that wouldn't require that is God, because he would be self-existent. He is his own explanation, but nothing else has that property. Like you could say the universe is. That's not satisfying. That doesn't make any sense. Why is it like it is? Why are the laws like that? Well, it just popped it into existence. Well, why? Even if you don't appeal to cause and effect, what, from whence? So, yeah. Well, I just think that's a really strong thing to appeal to because of its intuitive aspect.
Yeah, I've heard J.P. Moreland talk about how there has to be something self-existent for existence to be a thing. And of course, the problem is that, something exists and it had to come from somewhere. And then you could say, well, okay, why does that thing have its existence? And then you could say, why does that thing have its existence? And if there's nothing self-existent, you just keep going back into what's known as an infinite regress of events, right? So there's got to be something that's always existed that everything else comes from in order for there to be something, in order to avoid that infinite regress. And so that's kind of a similar idea as to what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's like this sort of ground of being or ground of reality.
Did my illustration make sense, though?
Yes. Believe me.
It makes perfect sense. That's right. So do you want to go on to the Bible's portrait of Jesus?
I have to say, for these first few chapters, because I read them, here's how I read the book. Not all in one go. I read like the first 3 chapters, and then I took a big old break, and then I read the rest of it leading up to our time of talking about it. So I'm a little fuzzy the first 3 chapters. So some of this is going to be a refresher if we talk about it.
Well, you know what? That's great because I have a lot to say about the chapter on does the Bible give a reliable picture of Jesus? So that actually works out really well.
Cool.
So a couple of things that I took from this chapter that I really appreciated, two that come to mind right away, and then a third that we may or may not get to. The first thing is this was the first time. Now, remember, it's been several years since I first read this book. I've read it a couple times. I want to say 3, but at least 2. But what I love about this chapter is how he says, he talks about how, okay, we've got these sources and we've got the Gospels, right? We've got the 4 Gospels. And of course, he talks about the dating of the Gospels and how most people think that Mark is the earliest Gospel. And then he talks about basically the traditional dates of the 4 Gospels. But there are these 7 uncontested letters of Paul. Now, what does that mean? That means that within New Testament scholarship, these 7 letters are without question that Paul wrote them. The large majority, everybody says, yeah, these are uncontested. The Apostle Paul wrote them. Okay, why is that significant? Because Paul gives us a ton of information about Jesus. And so Davis lays out all the information that Paul gives us about Jesus. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting is the letters of Paul were before the Gospel of Mark. So he creates this nice chain of custody where he says, okay, let's look at all this information that we get about Jesus from these uncontested letters, from the 7 uncontested letters. And I can tell you that it's a lot of information. Like, it's a good bit of information. I have it all listed, but, I don't know how exciting that would be, but let me tell you, it's a lot of information. So what happens is when you take a look at all that information that you get from these letters from Paul, and then you parallel it or compare it to Mark, the information is almost identical. Mm-hmm. So in other words, what's happening is these earlier letters, right? What's one of the knocks against the Gospels, right? Oh, they're written, much later after the events. Okay, well, I would contest from the point of view of antiquity, they are not. But let's say that holds, right? Okay, yeah, but we've got Paul's letters that are much earlier. So we see kind of what J. Warner Wallace would say is this chain of custody, right? Where we've got these letters of Paul that are early. They give us tons of information about Jesus. And then when we look at the Gospel of Mark, we can see that the information from Paul is very consistent with what we find in the Gospel of Mark. And then, of course, we have the synoptic Gospels, right? Mark, Luke, and Matthew. And so we have this nice picture of this early testimony that kind of substantiates what we find in our 3 synoptic Gospels. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that's really powerful. He actually says this: the Pauline letters were all written well before Mark, and indeed within 20 to 30 years of the death of Jesus. Accordingly, what Paul said about the life of Jesus is much more likely to be reliable on purely historical critical grounds than something written much later. And this reliability confirms the authenticity of later texts like Mark that largely agree with Paul on the life of Jesus. Mark does not appear to be a myth or fable or fiction. What we have here then is an impressive reason for regarding Mark as reliable. And so what he's saying is that we can actually use the letters of Paul to validate the Gospel of Mark. And I find that to be very powerful, especially when you consider the relationship between Matthew, Luke, and Mark.
Yes, it's coming back to me now that you described that. That is I'd never sort of seen that approach before, but I mean, again, that's not maybe my area of speciality. I like that. Do you think that's something you could use talking to people?
Yeah, I absolutely do, because I have used it in a conversation with somebody. I have a friend who is an atheist and is very skeptical about the reliability of the New Testament. And after reading this in Davis's book, I was actually he was calling into question the reliability of the Gospels. And I was able to explain to him that we have these 7 uncontested letters of Paul. I was able to read to him, because I wrote a blog post about it. I was able to pull up the blog post and I was able to read to him all the things that these letters tell us about Jesus and show him that these letters could confirm the Gospel of Mark. And I also told him, explained to him the relationship between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as they are synoptic. and able to show him the kind of that chain of custody that I was talking about. And he had not heard that either. And I think it gave him something to think about. So I absolutely think you could use it in a conversation.
Well, you heard it here first. You can use that. The next chapter, he's talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Was Jesus raised from the dead? How would you describe the approach?
This is where it's very tempting to get into the minimal facts versus the maximal facts debate and all of that, right?
Yeah.
But I think that both parties here, honestly, if they read Davis's book, I would like to think, I do have a side note, though, about inerrancy that I'll get to. But I do think both parties would find some things in here to like. I mean, as I said, in chapter 3, where he talks about, does the Bible give a reliable picture of Jesus? He argues for the reliability of the Gospels. He argues for the reliability of Paul. And so you see this argument for, as I said, the Gospels and Paul. But then he goes on in chapter 4, and then he says, okay, now that we've kind of established this idea that we have some reliable texts, like what can we garner from these texts? And that's when he does take what would be kind of a minimal facts approach, which I have some thoughts on. He argues for the empty tomb. He argues for the appearances, and he uses those kind of as his central arguments to demonstrate that the resurrection happened. He also uses an argument from Swinburne on probability. Now, this debate between the maximal facts and the minimal facts, which I don't want to get into that a lot. I just want to make a point here that I think is salient, and I also think it is helpful when it comes to these two chapters. Just allow me to make the point. I like how in chapter 3, he argues for the reliability of the Gospels, and then he goes on and says, okay, let's look at a few facts from the Gospels, and we're going to make a case. I think sometimes people get hung up on that term minimal, right? Because they want to say, oh, well, we don't want to use the minimal facts. I like this idea of just using the central facts.
Yeah, so, I think that's what he says, the central facts regarding it, the things that are most pertinent, that are historically credible, that no one's going to contest. But he's not appealing to this many people agree and 100% agree. And these are we're only going to go with the ones that people agree on or anything. He's just saying these are the core components of making a case for the resurrection. So it's almost like going like this. I don't care if it's minimal, maximal, whatever. These are the pillars for making the case. Now, that just so happens that they're really reliable pillars to use. So it's like kind of, as Craig would say, it doesn't end run around the whole debate. Like, hey, you're going to have to argue that the tomb was empty. You're going to have to argue that Jesus died. You're going to have to argue that everyone saw him and there was eyewitness testimony. So, and then, well, there you have it. You're starting to build a case with those big pillars.
Yeah. And so I very much like the fact that also that, because if you're in a conversation, if you've ever been in a conversation with somebody about the evidence for the resurrection, sometimes it's difficult to present it if you present it in the way of, oh, okay, well, we've got these reliable documents. Okay, well, but that doesn't tell you what the reliable documents say, right? So let's take it a next step and let's say we've got these documents. We have good reason to believe they're reliable, but we're just going to focus on these facts because it allows for a concise case to be made. So, for example, if I say, OK, the Gospels are reliable, we've got these early letters of Paul, and we're going to focus on the fact that they tell us that Jesus was crucified, that his disciples claimed and believed that he rose from the dead, that the Apostle Paul and James, the skeptics, changed their minds, and that the tomb was empty. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on. Well, that doesn't say I'm throwing out the other things that the Gospels present, and I can call upon those if I need them, but that allows me to centralize my case into something that's digestible to somebody, especially for somebody who's not familiar with the Bible, right? Because there's a lot going on in the Gospels around the resurrection accounts and things. Yeah.
I'm just reminded here about how the evidence you bring to a case really depends on your audience. if you think, okay, let's say I'm interacting with a hardcore skeptic who's read all of Bart Ehrman's books, who's been watching all the atheist stuff, and now you like, okay, well, I need a really robust, very detailed, very meticulous, airtight case, and I need to know every counter argument they're going to make. Okay,
Right.
you might choose a certain sort of strategy, your gambit that you might use in that sort of interaction, because you know that, okay, this is going to be meticulously torn apart if I don't give them, well, if I give any holes in my case where people are going to try to tear it apart, then I have to be very careful. Now, that's going to be a completely different approach. I know I'm using way extremes here. If I'm trying to say to my son who's 10, why should you believe Jesus rose from the dead? You know, way different. Or if you're talking to a Christian who's like, yeah, I believe it, but why should I believe it? I mean, I just believe it by faith. Then you're going to make a different case. One where you don't have to appeal to facts that are hugely historically, backed, because the only way that someone's going to receive that is if they have confidence, historical confidence. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So I just am reminded of that when we're talking here, because he seems to just say, well, here's how do I really know it's true? He's appealing to historical credibility. He's appealing to the evidence that we have. And I think that's what the normal person who is a little skeptical and needs to have a rational grounding and a reasonable rational grounding, not, okay, can you prove it historically or something, or is this truly the best explanation? Well, he does say that's the best explanation, but for a Christian who needs backing of their faith, I don't think we have to worry, so to speak, about having a huge, airtight kind of meticulous sort of thing. It actually will turn them off, because they think that the only way you can have confidence is if you're meticulously, have every I dotted and every T crossed historically, and every possible objection defended against. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and I mean, who can say that about any view they hold? I mean, regardless of what your view is, I mean, who can say, oh, yeah, I've got answers to all my questions, and I'm not curious about anything. I figured everything out.
So that's basically 4 out of the 9 chapters we've kind of covered. That's halfway through the book. And so, listener, we're going to wrap it up for now. This is part 1 of our review, probably our part 1 of 2 of the review of this book and discussion about some of the themes. If you have any thoughts, you can tell us by sending an email to podcast@apologetics315.com. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoy this, and we'll be having further interviews after we're done with this book. So we'll talk to you then.
Later.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address, or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.